Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sergio Coronado. I'm with FRA's Program and Policy Development Division. We handle all of FRA's discretionary grant programs, including program cost elimination. So welcome, everyone. This is our first iteration of our RCE office hours. I'll be covering some best practices on structuring your application narrative. I hope this serves as a helpful guide to make our application process a little more user-friendly. So go ahead and get started. So before jumping into the agenda or the presentation itself, I just want to point out that, we have a series coming up. So every following Thursday at 2 p.m., we'll cover a series of different topics. So for example, next week we'll cover project and applicant eligibility. The following week will be statement of work, NEPA, and then, our NOFO nuts and bolts, such as grants.gov, SAM registration, and other requirements. So, if you feel like your question or your concern wasn't addressed in this specific webinar, keep a lookout. We'll address more things as we go on. So, to jump into the agenda, I'll be providing you a bit of an overview of the competitive grant process, and hopefully this will provide a little context for the overall narrative itself and why it's important to kind of structure things the way maybe this is going to help you or help you guide you. And then, jump into the components of the narrative, everything from the cover page to environmental readiness. And then I'll have a series of tools and resources throughout the presentation, but at the end of the presentation, everything that I mentioned, as far as websites or links, will be covered in a slide, which you'll be able to access. And then we'll jump into the question segment. So if you do have questions, I encourage you to use our question and answer pod, and then we'll answer them at the end of this presentation. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go over the FRA Competitive Discretionary Grant Review Process. So it's about 4 steps, and with each step, there's a little bit of information that goes into it. So we start with our intake and eligibility process. So again, we look at whether this project is eligible. If the applicants themselves are eligible, is all the required documentation there, such as our statement of work and, of course, the narrative itself. If everything checks all of these boxes, it then goes to our evaluation process. So this is one panel of about 3 FRA career staff, anyone from an economist to an engineer, railroad safety inspector, or a community planner will gather and look at your application. And they'll see, what are these projects' benefits? Does this improve safety, economic vitality? Does this improve access to emergency services? And they also look at your technical capacity. They want to see if you're capable of carrying out those projects. Have you completed projects of a similar scope before? And then, together, they review your application, they come up with a couple of talking points, they score it, and then they provide this information over to the FRA administrator. And that goes then to the selection process. So, then projects are selected based off their ability to meet the evaluation selection criteria as outlined in the NOFO. And from there, we obviously select these and then announce them 4 to 5 months following the due date. If you're wondering what the due date is, it's October 4th. So what goes into a project narrative? There's essentially 11 components. There's your cover page, your project summary, funding, eligibility, detailed project description, location, grade crossing information, evaluation selection criteria, safety benefit, project implementation and management, and environmental readiness. Now, don't let this overwhelm you just yet. We're going to cover each component. But, just some key points to keep in mind throughout this whole presentation. The NOFO at the end of the day, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, is the official document. This presentation just serves as a guide, but at the end of the day, the NOFO is going to be your key document to adhere to. Include all the elements identified in the outline, which are here. Follow the instructions for each element, which are contained in the NOFO itself. And then, of course, adhere to the 25-page limit. So to start with the cover page, don't let the cover page overwhelm you, and don't overwhelm the cover page. So, keep it simple. Use a table, create a list, open up an Excel or Word document, and just take these components and address them individually. So start with your project title, funding request, proposed match, other federal funding, and I'm not going to go through each one, but you kind of get the list, or the gist, I should say. Just address each component, again, using a table or a list. Don't make it too complicated. Don't overthink it. But just a note on the project title, we encourage you to keep your title relevant to the scope of work. You don't need a fancy title to get your point across. Simple is good. far as the project summary, so this is can be a little difficult at times for a lot of applicants, but you don't have to do very much here. You just have to briefly describe it in 4 to 6 sentences. Tell us what your project is, where it is, how much money you're requesting, and why. Don't start off by don't start off by confusing your reviewers. Keep it simple. And also don't front load all your information. There's a time and a place for describing your experience with similar projects or the benefits, but this is not it. We just want a quick synopsis of your project. And if you want some examples to kind of model your project summary off of, I encourage you to look at our FY21 press releases. There you'll see a very simple summary that kind of contains all the information we're looking for. I strongly encourage you to model your project summary off of these. We won't accuse you of plagiarism or anything like that. Again, just a reminder, don't front load all your information. There's a time and a place for your benefits, for the project challenges and the description of safety improvements, but this is not it. When it comes to the project funding, we strongly encourage tables. Summary of your project funding is good, but tables are a reviewer's best friend. It's a visual component to your description. It's easy to refer back to, and also easy for FRA staff to describe to selecting officials. When you're putting together your project funding summary or table, we just ask you to keep it relevant. Only include the eligible costs. We also ask that you specify each source of non-federal match, providing supporting documentation either as an attachment to your application or by hyperlinking. Provide details about in-kind match, indicate, public versus private sector match, identify if the proposed match will not be available. So essentially, if you're relying on another competitive grant, whether that's federal or state, just tell us and give us a timeline for this. And so when you're structuring your table, here's an example. Obviously, we have the grant request, local funding, state funding, railroad company, private funding, and broken up by percentage and amount. Obviously, that has to add up to 100%, of course. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. Jumped the gun there. So when we're talking about applicant and project eligibility, it's quite simple. You can think about it as a step-by-step process. You're going to obviously start off by looking at the NOFO. You can match your project to the eligible project type, which is on the right-hand side there. You can match your applicant to the eligible applicant type. Then you're going to go ahead and make your case. There's a specific section in the narrative where you do this. Describe your project and how it meets the criteria and how you meet the criteria as well. And then along with that, there's going to be references there. Provide supporting documentation, cite legislation as necessary, provide hyperlinks to some of this documentation. We encourage you to provide a justification of your project, for all aspects. So for example, roadway construction, if that's part of your project and required to make the project fully operational, it's considered eligible, but we want to know that you need to go ahead and describe that in this section. And I also want to point out, actually, you won't see that here in this list on the right-hand side, but rail right-of-way acquisition is an eligible activity. And if you're wondering more about your specific project and eligibility, as I mentioned, there's a specific series of office hours that are going to be dedicated just to that. Next, we have our detailed project description. So this is where you really want to hone in on your project. Again, you can thoroughly discuss the challenges and benefits. We encourage the use of data to support project benefits. Including photographs or diagrams goes a long way. It's descriptive, but then we also see a visual element to it. Identifying all host railroads, operators, and beneficiaries. As you see here on the right-hand side, we have a very simple mock-up of what a general project description. We have a series of 2 pictures, the location of the project, simple description, relevant history of the project, such as, these XX grade crossings are dangerous and we want to grade overpass. A summary of your benefits, XX fatality will be prevented by this project, describing how and why. A summary of who benefits, whether it's town residents, emergency services, freight operators, and then host railroad. We want to see the status of your negotiations. Summarize those for us. Are they ongoing? Do you have letters of support from these folks? We want to see draft negotiation documents as well. And again, I just want to strongly encourage you to, when possible, quantify your benefits. And also a reminder, Don't let this be the only time you talk about your benefits. This is a project description, but there is during the evaluation selection criteria, really when you want to hone in on your benefits. Just because you mention them here doesn't mean you can suddenly omit them from the rest of your application. Again, don't let this be the only time you talk about your benefits. When we're talking about project location, identify all relevant information, of course. The cities, counties, the states, if you have a corridor project, where this is going to be located, including congressional districts of your project, including maps, multiple if necessary, identifying railroad milepost geospatial data to include longitude and latitude. And we have resources for this. Obviously, Google Maps is a good tool and free, of course. But we have a FRA safety map, which has all this relevant information. You can access this via our website. And as I mentioned at the end of this presentation, there's going to be a link for that as well. And if you're going to include, a qualitative description of demographics, this is good as long as it's relevant to demonstrating your benefits. So if you're tying it into safety or economic benefits, and then implementing just this 40 data, that's something we want to see. But again, keep it relevant. As far as grade crossing information, so this is another segment that we want to see. Obviously, we need to see who owns the infrastructure, the primary operator, the DOT crossing inventory number, and roadway at the crossing. So, we have resources for you to access all this information. We have our safety map, but we also have our grade crossing inventory. This allows you to search by state, street, county, or crossing number. You may have some of this information already on hand. You may already know, obviously, where your crossing is located in your state. But some of the information such as milepost, crossing number, you may need. And this is a great resource and also required. Let's talk about evaluation selection criteria. The NOFO lays out the project benefits and technical merits that we want to see in your project. So, we ask that you describe each of these, both qualitative and quantitative, and we ask that you keep it relevant. Don't digress to other projects. I know it can be tempting to bring benefits in from a neighboring project if it's somewhat related, but I just urge you to keep it specific to the project or projects if it's a corridor project. Keep the benefits tied to what you're applying for. Try to keep it as specific as possible. Don't, digress to other projects. It's going to make it confusing for your reviewer. And don't rely solely on the contents of your detailed project description. I mentioned, don't let that be the only time you talk about your benefits. If you mentioned it before, mention it again. As I have it there, bolded, address it again. Address each component as well. Don't bunch up your benefits into one giant summary. We want to see you address each criteria individually rather than a large summary. That's really what the project description is for. Don't do that in your evaluation selection area. If a reviewer needs to go back and advocate for you or your project, it's going to be difficult to do that in a summary. They can, if you separate it out by component, they can go back and just look at that specific component. So in addition to the evaluation selection criteria, we really want to see you hone in on the safety benefit. As part of this program, we really want to see projects that are going to drive the safety message home. And, we understand that that's going to require data, and we understand that there are resources going to be required for that. So that being said, we have the FRA grade crossing dashboard, our FRA accident prediction system, both of which have the historical data that you'll want and need to make your safety justification. You really want to drive the point home. Again, repeating the benefits is necessary. You may have talked about safety early on, whether that was in your project description or whether that was in the evaluation selection criteria, but we ask that you continue to repeat yourself, address it again, don't sell yourself short. So project implementation and management, we want you to highlight your past experience, whether that's, working with the FRA or other DOT programs such as RAISE, which was formerly known as Tiger and formerly known as BUILD, or CRISI grants. Maybe you've worked with FTA or federal highways, or maybe you just manage state grants or local funding, any relevant transportation funding, whether that's, public or private. We just want to see your experience with it. We want to hear you talk about it. It demonstrates your ability to carry out projects of a similar scope. Again, don't sell yourself short. And I discussed the makeup of the panelists earlier, and this is important because Some of you may work with our engineers or our community planners, but that doesn't mean they are necessarily going to review your application. You need to assume that your reviewer has never heard of you and really make your case here. So when it comes to environmental readiness, I'm no NEPA expert, but I'll do my best to summarize this as succinctly as possible. If NEPA is complete, provide a copy of that document or a hyperlink, as I mentioned. If NEPA is not started, then provide a detailed project description. If NEPA is underway, give us the current status, expected completion date, and type of document. And provide as much information as you can. More information than less. Describe your project planning done to date. Document any past or present environmental studies associated with the project, whether that's from FRA, FTA, or federal highways related to the grant proposal. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a series of office hours dedicated to these specific areas. NEPA will be one of those. Again, just reiterating, provide as much information on the project as possible. So in summary, help your reviewer. Keep it simple and straightforward. More information is good as long as it's relevant. Supporting documentation, you can attach documents as attachments or submit them via hyperlink in the relevant area, but make sure you include them either way. Repetition is key. Don't sell yourself short. No detective work. Don't make your reviewer go digging for information. Make it simple and easy for them to find. If they need to find the economic impact of your application, spell that out. Don't hide it in a random paragraph where no one's going to find it. And that comes to, no detective work regarding benefits, your costs, your project funding, the scope or the stage of your project. Keep your benefits qualitative and quantitative. That goes a long way. No assumptions. Don't assume your reviewer knows where your project is or knows your experience with FRA or rail operations, and assume they don't know anything about your project. Provide as much information as relevant and as necessary. So as promised, here's a couple of tools to hopefully structure your narrative. Broken up by component. So we have our cover page. Obviously, your resource for that is going to be the NOFO. Your project summary, a hyperlink to our FY21 CRISI press releases. You can just model your project summary off of that. The project funding, your resources are going to be the NOFO, but if you're looking at in-kind contributions, we have the CFR describing what that process is like. We have also our FRA statement of work budget template. Eligibility, the NOFO is going to be your best tool. Same with detailed project description. As for project location, we have various tools actually. So as I mentioned time and time again, we have the FRA safety map. But the rural eligibility tool is more of a demographic map to see, the rural areas surrounding your project. Congressional districts, we want to see that information. Justice 40, if you want some demographic tools. For grade crossing information, there's a link to our grade crossing inventory. Evaluation selection criteria, the information is all going to be in the NOFO. For safety benefit, here's a series of tools, really. We have the Office of Safety Analysis, the Web Accident Prediction System, as I mentioned, the Highway Rail Grade Crossing Incident Dashboard, where you're going to pull all your data from. For project implementation and management, we have our FRA reporting standards and our templates for the statement of work. Environmental readiness, we have our CE worksheet, the companion guide, FRA NEPA procedures, and a YouTube recording on how NEPA impacts our competitive grant process. So I'm really giving you a bucket of tools here to hopefully structure your narrative, make it more competitive, because we do want to see strong applications at the end of the day. And hopefully these tools will help you.